Really, this is putting life and death consequences on being a mercenary. They're quite heavy consequences. There's also a United Nations Convention against the recruitment, use, training, and financing of mercenaries, which was created in 1989 and came into force in 2001. And I'm going to focus on Article 47, but I'm happy to discuss anything else, any of those other laws if people wish. What's interesting about these laws is that they don't work. They're full of loopholes, and the loopholes are so severe that they've never actually been used to deal with mercenaries. Not only that, but it appears as though they don't apply to the private security companies that we see today. And those of you who were kind enough to join this afternoon will have heard that it's a significant problem in Iraq where there's no body of overarching international law to deal with these 20 to 60,000 contractors who are operating. The law is so bad that there's a very famous quote which gets bandied about. Basically, if you write an article on this industry, it's mandatory that you put this quote in your article, and that's that any mercenary who cannot exclude himself from this definition deserves to be shot, and his lawyer with him. So what I'll do now is I'll go through and explain to you what these loopholes are. So this is the definition from the article. And the first loophole that we see is the idea that mercenaries have to take a direct part in hostilities. That means to be a mercenary, you have to actually fight. This is an interesting piece of international law because it's cumulative. So to be a mercenary, you have to actually meet every single one of those criteria, which in itself makes the law quite difficult to apply to people. The other little loophole that's involved in here is that you can't be sent on official duty as a member of your armed forces. That's F. And that excludes, for example, a NATO soldier serving for a Canadian NATO soldier serving in Britain would not be considered a mercenary because he's been sent as a state or as part of official duties. So another loophole here, and this is one of the bigger ones, comes in C, which is the idea that mercenaries, we know a mercenary is a mercenary because a mercenary is motivated by private gain. What they're in it is, they're in it for the money. They're motivated by hard cash. How do we tell that someone is a mercenary? Because everybody gets paid? Well, we tell because they get paid more than regular soldiers. They get substantially in excess of what a regular soldier would get paid. So not only do we know what a mercenary is, he's someone who fights for money, we have a practical way to go out there and tell on the battlefield. Now the problem with this is that if you were a mercenary, wouldn't the sensible thing to do be to make sure that you got paid on paper exactly the same as what everybody else got paid? And then you don't meet this criteria, and then the law doesn't apply to you. Similarly, the last loophole is this idea that mercenaries cannot be a member of armed forces of a party to the conflict. Well, there's a simple way around this objection as well. You just make sure you're a member of the armed forces. And in fact, most mercenaries, what they would do is officially enroll in the armed forces of the state that was hiring them or of a party to the conflict, and then the definition no longer applied to them. So this law is really easy to get around, and the quote is largely right. If you got caught under this law, you would have to be as stupid as the mercenary who tried to smuggle his guns in through the something to declare line at customs. But what does this ineffective law mean? Why does it matter? Why did I spend a disturbingly long period of time trying to figure out what about this law didn't work? The cynical answer, and in international relations, most people think that this is not particularly surprising. The reason why the law doesn't work is because states don't pay any attention to international law anyway. So we shouldn't be at all surprised that in this case, we ended up with weak law. And if you take that view, there are a number of reasons why this law might be so weak. The first is states just didn't care. If states don't care, what could we expect other than a really bad law? So states didn't care enough, therefore the law was bad. The other reason might be even more cynical than that, and that's the law is weak on purpose. If you wanted to use mercenaries yourself, but make it quite difficult for non-state adversaries, so national liberation groups, to use mercenaries, you would go out and devise law that looked an awful lot like this. Because it would be in your interest to do so, you would make purposely weak law, which would make it easy for you to hire mercenaries. Another explanation might be that the wrong states were interested in the creation of law, that mercenaries were primarily an issue that affected African states, and that African states aren't particularly powerful in the international system, and therefore they couldn't get enough international consensus built to devise effective law. We would expect that if strong states were interested in this regime, we might see more effective law. Another explanation might be that international law, like a lot of other agreements, represents the lowest common denominator on which states can agree. So if you have a bunch of people sitting around a table arguing about what they should put in the law, what you're going to end up with is the bare minimum that people can actually agree on. And this actually serves a really important domestic purpose, because then you can go home and say, oh, well, we negotiated for months and this was all we could agree on. So it sends a useful domestic message, and you've gone through this minimal effort to create the law. I went through and I read all of the travaux préparatoires, which are the preparatory documents to creating an international law. And what I discovered was that none of these explanations is true. That in fact, the reason why this law is so weak was because states cared very, very deeply about the mercenary issue. And in particular, they had a set of normative concerns about the use of private force that they were very concerned about. What they were unable to do was translate their moral concern into effective law. So when I say there is a norm against mercenary use and states had a normative concern, they were deeply committed to this norm, what do I mean? Well, in international relations, we say a norm is basically, it's a standard of behavior defined in terms of rights or obligations, or even more simply than that, it's an unwritten rule that we follow most of the time. And it may, in some cases, be written down. A prescriptive norm is a term that often comes up in the literature on this kind of subject, and that's quite simple too. All that is a norm which prohibits a course of action. So I argue that there's a very strong norm against the use of mercenaries, that there's an unwritten rule in the international system that says using mercenaries is a bad idea, and this norm is particularly prevalent at this stage in the 60s and 70s. It has two components. The first is we're generally uncomfortable when people who aren't states use force. So when somebody uses force outside of authoritative control, we don't like that. We prefer a world where it's nice and neatly organized, and the only people who are allowed to engage in war are states. We're also concerned about the idea of killing for money, or killing without an appropriate cause. You have to be able to point to something higher than yourself if it's your business to engage in war. And the difference with mercenaries is that mercenaries can't say, oh, I'm doing it for ideology, because what mercenaries are doing it for is the money. Now, there's two interesting points to note here about these aspects of the norm against mercenary use. And the most important is that this isn't logical. Okay, we can imagine all kinds of scenarios where soldiers might fight for money. You know, we recruit soldiers because it's a good job, because you get benefits, because you get education. So they might be fighting for money as well. But despite the fact that it's illogical, it's enormously powerful, and you see it really reflected in the international lawmaking process. So why do I say that this norm was very influential in the 60s and 70s? Well, the first reason is we simply saw no mercenary use whatsoever on the international stage from the 1850s to 1960. And this is despite the fact that mercenaries were incredibly common on the battlefields of Europe prior to the 1850s. This, you might say to me, okay, well that doesn't tell us anything, because the disappearance of a practice doesn't mean that it was because of a norm. We also don't have longbows on battlefields today. We don't use crossbows. We don't use catapults. But we don't assume that that's because there was a norm against them. So how would I tell you, how would I go about demonstrating that the norm against mercenary use is at work here? And the first way I would do it is point out what the international reaction was when mercenaries reappeared on the international stage. If people thought they were okay, we would expect them not to say much about it, to treat it as though it were a regular occurrence. And that's not what happened. In fact, there was an extreme international reaction to the reappearance of mercenaries and a very, very high degree of international concern. When mercenaries were used, they were only used illegitimately and covertly. So they tended to be used by people planning coup attempts. They were used extremely often by post-colonial forces who wanted to maintain the status quo. So in the Congo, it was Belgian settlers who had been in charge of the colony, who wanted to keep their fingers on the reins of power, who hired the mercenaries. They weren't used by states, and they weren't, generally speaking, used for legitimate causes, with the only exception being the Nigerian breakaway state of Biafra. And Biafra is quite interesting because there was a great deal of sympathy for the Biafran cause. People very strongly believed that the Biafrans were right to be fighting, and yet they were massively condemned for their choice to hire mercenaries, to the point that they only had mercenaries working for them for about 6 months. There were well over 100 General Assembly resolutions regarding mercenaries, calling them criminals, calling them all sorts of nasty names in this period. There were a number of Security Council resolutions. There were the Organization for African Unity made a series of resolutions and then created the convention that I mentioned. As part of the Angola trial in 1976, when the mercenaries were captured and then ultimately executed, the Angolan government set up a commission of experts where they brought people from all over the world. They brought over 50 experts to sit down and create a draft convention because they believed this problem to be so serious. And they did create the convention, and much of it is actually reflected in the text of Article 47, which we just talked about a moment ago. Harold Wilson, who was the British Prime Minister at the time of the execution of the mercenary